The Andy Pollin Show.
We got to go after this with everything we got, figuring they're going to come with everything they got.
I'll start off by saying I'm bored, I'm broke, and I'm back.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630 starts right now.
We're still 10 days away from it being official, but Deebo Sanuel added over the weekend for a fifth-round pick. You save your cap money, you can make moves like that. And a big one for the Commanders over the weekend. We'll look at that. Also, it was 63 years ago yesterday that Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in a game. If it happened today, it would be televised. It would be covered and recovered and talked about for days and months. But 63 years ago yesterday, it was played in obscurity before 4,000 fans. And to this day, debate remains as to whether or not it happened. Now, this is not like the conspiracists who say, oh, no, he didn't walk on the moon. They shot that in a studio. And certainly these days you can find any number of things that actually happened and somebody will deny that they did. But it seems pretty clear-cut that Wilt scored 100 points in a game against the New York Knicks on March 2nd of 1962. But it took some really good work by Pablo Torre, who does a podcast every day called Pablo Finds Out. And he talked to Gary Pomerantz, who wrote a book pretty much about that game. It's called Wilt 1962. Goes into the backstory and so forth. But it is, I think, the most dominant individual performance in a team sport we have ever seen. And in the grand scheme of things, what does it mean? It was a regular season game. The Warriors, it was the Philadelphia Warriors then, they did not go on to win the NBA championship. The Boston Celtics did. But looking back on it, there's so many interesting facets to it, including a sort of involvement by Sonny Jurgensen. And I'll get to the whole story coming up at 10 o'clock. It's really fun. It's really fun to listen to the various accounts of what happened, including guys who played in the game. And sadly, only one player remains. That's Tom Meschery, who was a teammate of Wilt that day in 1962. He's now in his 80s. And he says, those who want to doubt, forget about it. But we'll get to all that. Deebo Sanuel, when you heard this on Saturday, I don't think it would be a shock because it's been pretty well known that they're going to add to the wide receiver room, as they call it these days. I still have to get used to that. Wide receiver room. I don't ever remember that back in the day. Oh, there's Sonny Jurgensen and Billy Kilmer in the quarterback room. But now this is how things are done. They meet in separate areas. And when you hear like a lineman say, oh, we've got a great room here, quarterbacks say that, wide receivers, running backs, they all have their separate little meeting rooms, and everybody comes together as a team. But they have only two receivers under contract. One is Terry McLaurin, and the other is Luke McCaffrey. Now, once Deebo Sanuel gets here, he'll be making more money per year than Terry McLaurin. On some teams, that might be a problem. I don't think that will be a problem for McLaurin. And reality is, to free up some more cap room, what they'll probably do with McLaurin's deal, which also has only 1 year left, is they will sign him to an extension and stretch it out a little bit more. I would think that McLaurin's got 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 good years left. And Deebo's a question. 29 years old. He's been hurt. Did not have a great year last year, partly because of injury. And I think it's worth the gamble. There is no gamble because you're only giving up a fifth-round pick. You're chewing up some of your cap room, but you got a lot to chew up. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. And look at the great success they had last year with Zach Ertz and, on the other side of the ball, Bobby Wagner. So getting an aging wide receiver is not such a bad idea, especially when you have a team that in the next 2 years should be going for it. Now, the big problem is the team in the division. Philadelphia is a better team. Philadelphia is going to be a good team for a while. It's not like an aging team that wheezed over the finish line. They blew out the two-time defending champs in the Super Bowl and look like they're poised to go back next year. But it's tough to get back, and it's tough to win back-to-back Super Bowls. And if there is another meeting between Washington and Philadelphia, as Washington continues to load up, and what they do in the draft, we'll see what happens if, in fact, it comes down to that next year. John Keim has covered this team for 30 years, and he puts out a podcast, and this is what he had to say about the acquisition of Deebo Sanuel and the kind of player that they're getting at the age of 29.
2021, he was dominant. I think he had, over 1,700 yards from scrimmage, was a key reason why the 49ers did very well that year, getting to the NFC Championship game. And he was a dominant player. Has not been that same kind of guy since. He is still a very good player, though. And the question, though, is he just turned 29. He's dealt with some injuries over the years. He hasn't missed a lot of games. If you look at his games played, so I think it's like a combined 9 in the last 4 years. But you just wonder with his physical style and then getting carries out of the backfield, routes as a receiver, et cetera, the physical toll, what does it take on him? Last year, he missed games because I think it was calf, wrist, oblique, and rib. So what kind of toll does that take on a player, and how will his game age? And I think that's, so I think that could speak to what they do in the future. But a couple things to know is, obviously, Adam Peters is very familiar with Deebo. He was in San Francisco when they drafted him in 2019 in the second round. And then Anthony Lynn, Washington's run game coordinator, was an assistant head coach and running backs coach with the 49ers for 2 years. So they're intimately aware of what Samuel, who he is and what he brings. And I say that because we know from last year, a major key for all their big moves was firsthand knowledge of the player. So they have firsthand knowledge of the player and what he adds and what, all that good stuff. Now, I should mention, as I record this, the trade is still pending him taking a physical. So just understand that. So anyway, but that firsthand knowledge is key, not just of what he can do on the field. We can see that, right? But also what he adds to the locker room, what kind of player, what kind of person he is inside there, and for the organization. I think if they weren't confident in what he adds, they would not take him. And that means how he's going to report to camp and the kind of shape he'll be in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that that's a concern, because if it was, I don't think they would have made this kind of move.
And that's an important point that John makes about what he's going to be in the locker room, because anytime you listen to Dan Quinn talk about this, players like Terry McLaurin, like Jaden Daniels, they all talk about the culture that's been built here. And not that Deebo Sanuel is a divo, but he has been an all-pro player, which Terry McLaurin has not been. Terry McLaurin has had an amazing career given the parade of quarterbacks that he's gone through. I believe Jaden Daniels was the 12th different starter that he played with since coming here in 2019. And he's never had a guy on the other side. And Deebo's got to understand that he's going to be the guy on the other side. That as we talk about the room, the wide receiver room, this is Terry McLaurin's room. And he's an addition to it, but he's not going to own it. Now, as far as the numbers go, here's what Jerry Brewer put in his column today about what has happened in the last few years. Yes, he did peak in 2021 with 77 catches, 1,400 yards. And here's something else that he brings: 365 yards rushing. I'll get back to more on that in a second, plus 14 touchdowns. Then you got 2021 or 2022, 2023, and then last year, here's how the production has dropped off, partly because of injury and other factors with the 49ers who weren't nearly close to being a Super Bowl team this year. In fact, they didn't even make the playoffs. But he caught 51 passes as opposed to 77 in 2021, 670 yards, only 3 touchdowns, 14 touchdowns in 2021, and he rushed for 136 yards and a score. So since that big season that he had in 2021, the last 3 years, he's averaged 3.9 catches and 51 yards per game. Those are pretty pedestrian numbers. Those are pretty much De'Ami Brown type of numbers. But he's a guy who, if healthy and fully motivated, and this is going to be a big opportunity for him, coming here looking to extend his career. He's due $17 million. It's like a $15 million cap hit. And by the way, according to Diana Rossini of The Athletic, that Washington tried to include Jonathan Allen in the deal, and the 49ers weren't interested. That would have made pretty much a one-for-one salary swap if they did it. But because they have so much cap room, they're able to get him for only a fifth-round pick. And, that really isn't much of a gamble on their part. Now, Chris Canty, who's part of our morning show on Sportsmanlike, believes that what you're getting here is not only a guy who's a wide receiver, but in many ways, like Luke McCaffrey's brother, Christian McCaffrey, he can do a lot of other things, and you can line him up in different places, and you can play him at running back on passing downs and things like that. So that, as Canty points out, is going to mean a whole lot of weapons that are going to be available for Cliff Kingsbury.
Yeah, almost like basketball on grass, positionless, just getting the ball in their hands as many times in as many different places to apply pressure on the defense. What I like about Deebo is that he stretches the field vertically and horizontally, right? Because of all of the different places that you can deploy him, the different schemes that you can run with him, whether it's flares with him as a running back, it's smokes with him lining up as a wide receiver, different screens. I mean, Deebo gives you a lot of versatility, but the one thing that we know about Deebo Samuels as well is that he's going to miss time. He's going into his 7th season in the NFL. He ain't had 1 year where he's played all regular season games, not one. So in terms of reliability, I think that it's important for Washington to get more bodies in that receiving room because you know that at some point Deebo inevitably is going to miss time. But why you trade for a guy like this is because he adds to the tough-mindedness, the overall physicality, the ruggedness in your offense. He gives you that tough style of play. And you're going to need that when you're trying to beat teams like the Philadelphia Eagles, the Detroit Lions, and the Green Bay Packers. So I like adding that type of player, that type of mindset into that locker room. Now it's about continuing to fortify that side of the ball with more playmakers around Jaden.
Yeah, now the question about the other wide receivers, you got two who are free agents here who they may want to re-sign. Noah Brown, who caught the Hail Mary in the Chicago game, got hurt, missed it's the last 6 or 7 games of the year. That's a possibility. And De'Ami Brown, who was kind of a forgotten guy going into last season, going into the last year of his rookie deal, and it was thought maybe he might not even make the team. But he was chosen over Jahan Dotson, who was a first-round pick. They shipped him off to Philadelphia for a couple of draft choices, and Brown really fit in very nicely here. He may be willing to take something of a discount to stay. He's a free agent as well. So they've got options that are already in-house now, at least until March 12th when the league year begins and the free agency period gets underway. But some of the guys they have might be back next year as they add more to the room. But Canty thinks that they may actually be looking around at the free agent class and possibly even before the league year starts, maybe making a trade.
Even by acquiring Deebo, there's still work that needs to be done in Washington, even in that wide receiver room. They only have 3 guys under contract. It's Deebo, Luke McCaffrey, and Terry McLaurin. So there's more work to be done. We'll see whether or not they bring back De'Ami Brown. He seemed to have a connection with Jaden Daniels, but didn't cover himself in glory in the conference championship game. I think that the Washington Commanders are still going to be in the business of finding touchdown scorers, finding playmakers to put around Jaden Daniels. They absolutely need more of that. I think they need more balance on the offensive side of the ball because you don't want your quarterback to also be your leading rusher. So they've got to figure that out as well. But this was a good first step for the Washington Commanders in terms of being able to add Deebo. Now we'll see what they do. I did think that trading for Deebo took them out of the T. Higgins sweepstakes. We'll see what happens with T. Higgins moving forward. But I do think it's altogether plausible that Washington is not done yet in terms of adding to that receiver room via the veteran receiver market.
Well, they get into if these guys are fully healthy with McLaurin and Deebo, what would that give Washington in terms of a wide receiver duo? Somebody mentioned that Deshaun Jackson and Pierre Garçon may have been the latest comp on that. Maybe it's similar. Somebody else mentioned, if you want to go way back, and this is probably before most of your time, whether it was Charlie Taylor and whether Roy Jefferson, that duo would be comparable. I would say this: Charlie Taylor is the greatest receiver ever played for the team, better than Art Monk. he was a spectacular wide receiver. The numbers don't tell you that, but in his day, he was the best receiver in the league and retired with the most catches of any receiver of all time. That's since almost been tripled by Jerry Rice, but that might be a comp on this. Somebody else mentioned Bobby Mitchell and Charlie Taylor. Yeah, they're both Hall of Famers. Didn't play together that long. I think it was like 3 years. But yeah, that might be a comp there. But the big thing is that you need not just a really good number one, and Terry McLaurin is, I wouldn't say, quite elite. He's probably a top 15 receiver, not a top 5, not a top 10. But you have that, and then you got Deebo, who's very intriguing. And if you look at his numbers from 2021, and if somehow at the age of 29, coming off a bunch of injuries, if he can match that again, well, they've hit the jackpot there. You give up a 5th-round pick for a guy like that, and we've jumped into this very quickly. A year ago at this time, we're looking at a 4-win team, hoping they can win maybe 7, and they won 12. They got to the NFC Championship game. And now, as you look at the next season, with Jaden Daniels under a rookie deal, being paid very little money, relatively speaking, this is the chance to go for it. And they went for it over the weekend with the Deebo Sanuel move. We'll see what other moves they make. But they are in go-for-it mode. They went from 0 to 60 like that. And get used to it. Hang on to your hats as they're moving forward. All right, we got some breaking news regarding baseball. In fact, we have one of these big breaking news things. So let me just play that. It's quite, it's not going to blow your socks off, but I think this rates as breaking news.
And now, breaking news from ESPN 630.
Okay, so the MASN dispute is over. Over. This release. The Washington Nationals and Baltimore Orioles jointly announced the final resolution of all issues related to the MASN dispute. Realize this has been going on for 20 years. Second paragraph. For the 2025 season, the Washington Nationals games will continue to be televised locally, exclusively by the Mid-Atlantic Sports Network. That's MASN. Under a new, this is important, 1-year contract. After this term, the Nationals will be free to explore alternatives for their television rights for the 2026 season and beyond. As part of the settlement, all disputes related to past media rights between the Nationals and Orioles and MASN have been resolved, and all litigation will be released. Whoa! Do you realize what has happened since 2005? Now, let's go back in history here. When the Montreal Expos, at that time owned by Major League Baseball, were looking to leave Montreal, there was even some talk of folding up the team, but realistically, that wasn't going to happen. Remember the contraction talk? Not all teams were as financially successful as they are now because media rights were a whole lot different then. But there was talk that baseball was just going to fold up the team. And they found that they wanted to go to Washington, of course. I would say that was always the destination to get to. The problem that teams feared in making their moves, and this goes back a long way, is that there was going to be litigation from Peter Angelos, who made his money in litigation, suing on behalf of asbestos victims. And so the feeling was he was claiming that, he was saying, this is my territory. It wasn't. But there was a fear that he was going to tie it up in court for so long, and there was going to be so many legal battles, they didn't want to do that. So the way that they were able to appease him, this was Peter Angelos then in his 70s, the way they were able to appease him in 2005 was to say, okay, the Orioles control the television rights for both teams, and you are to split the revenue. Well, there was no problem televising both teams, but the revenue became an enormous problem, and they went to court time after time after time. Washington would win in litigation, but then there would be other years that they still had to take care of. In other words, they would isolate it to like a 6 or 7 year period, and there was still another period of time. So there was all this money that was being battled over, and in that period, they won a World Series. They did spend money. A lot of it deferred, like in the case of Max Scherzer. but it all worked out in 2019 when they won the World Series. Now, since then, they've been a bargain basement team. There's a lot of reasons for it, including the commercial real estate market, which is where the learners have made their money, and that's tanking. And, there's a lot of things that led into that, plus the pandemic off of what they had. Right after the World Series, they really couldn't celebrate it in the way that they should have. And so all this stuff added up to the point where they're one of the lower payroll teams, including the money that they still have to pay to Strasburg. So this is a huge thing, and there's two things on it. One, they get all the money that's due to them from the Orioles. Peter Angelos has passed away, of course, and the team is owned by David Rubenstein. The other thing is that they're free to make a deal. So this now creates this scenario in my mind. This is what I think is going to happen. I think they're going to make a deal with Ted Leonsis to put the games on Monumental, and I believe that'll be the end of MASN. I don't believe that MASN will exist just to televise Orioles games. I'm not positive about that. I don't have any inside information. But given the way that these cable rights deals are going and the state of cable TV, where it all seems to be moving to streaming, my guess is that Ted will have both teams. He's got 2 channels. They've got the streaming. I could even see a scenario, and this is leverage that he will have, because if you pay for the streaming service of Monumental, that's extra money. So here's what I would think would happen. The Orioles and the Nationals both go to MASN. Now, when you get to the early part of the season for both teams, you're bumping up against the Caps and the Wizards. And if the Wizards do get good in a few years, although the way it works in both basketball and hockey, I believe, after the first round of the playoffs, everything goes to national TV. So there wouldn't be those conflicts. But there would be some conflicts with hockey and basketball. And what they would do in that case is one of the teams would be streaming only. This is the way things are going. Peacock's got a package of games. They've got other, and now that MLB has cut off or actually ESPN has said we're getting out of the baseball business. So after this year, they're not going to televise games. There's just going to be a lot of streaming. So this is a perfect setup for Ted Leonsis. He gets both teams. He's got 2 channels. He puts them on. However they do it now, one's on MASN 1, one's on MASN 2, the same way they do the Caps and the Wizards, and this is where this is going to go. I think that's the biggest part of this release. Yeah, the money for the Nats is huge. That's helpful. Money that's been tied up in court. All those disputes are taken care of. But the other thing is that after this year, because it's only a 1-year deal for the Nats to stay on MASN, that there is a deal with Monumental. And how many years away are we from just all streaming? Like, if you want games other than ones that may be on national TV, and who knows what baseball's going to do once their deal with ESPN is over. Do they put a lot of them on the MLB network? How does that work? But that is another thing to keep an eye on. We are moving in a direction of cutting the cord for everybody. It just doesn't make sense. The technology is there. I mean, these Comcast trucks and Xfinity trucks where they come over and they see what's wrong with your cable box, all that goes away. It's all tied into streaming. You don't need any of that anymore. It's a new, nobody's slower to adapt to technology than I am, but you can see what's coming here. And I think this will be the end of MASN. It was a good move on the part of baseball. That created a pathway for the Expos to come here in 2005. But 20 years later, we're in a whole different place with television and streaming. And what is happening here is a move towards the future. So, boy, after all the words that have been expelled over the last 20 years about this, it all comes to an abrupt end today with the deal. A deal is in place now. The Nationals 1 more year on MASN, and then they're free to make a deal someplace else. I think this will be the last year of MASN. The Orioles will have something similar. I think they're all going to be tied into Monumental. That's my guess. Or maybe there's some other streaming/cable service that is coming about. But that's the way it's going. The other thing with baseball is what they're finding is the people that are watching games on cable are like in my age group. Younger people don't watch cable. So if they're trying to build a younger audience, we're gonna get our kids to help us figure out how to do this, but we're gonna watch the games that way. And the kids, of course, already know how to do it, and many of them are watching on their phones or laptops or however they do it. So that's where we are right now, and that is an enormous story locally that the MASN deal is going to go in a completely different direction, and the dispute, which has been going on forever, is over. Orioles and Nationals have resolved their differences. Everything is great, and we move forward with one last year on MASN. All right, coming up in the next hour, 63 years ago yesterday, Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in a game. Yet, 6 decades later, even though there's box scores and there is one iconic picture which tells you he scored 100 points, people doubt it. Pablo Torre investigated that, and we'll go through his research as we continue. It's the Andy Poland Show, ESPN 630.
Hard to believe, but we are coming up on the 36th anniversary of the debate. Should Pete Rose be in the Hall of Fame? August of 1989, he was banned from baseball for life by then-Commissioner Bart Giamatti. At that time, he was eligible to be on the ballot for the Hall of Fame, even though he was banned. But a couple of years later, baseball passed a new rule, and the debate has raged on and on and on. And there is yet another story about, well, maybe baseball is considering reinstating Pete Rose because he had a lifetime ban, and the lifetime ended last September when he passed away. I've been doing sports radio since it was invented, and it's coming up on this year in July. It'll be 38 years, and I can't think of another story which has chewed up more airtime nationally. And we'll get to the latest from Don Van Natta on that. Also, the president decided to put himself into the middle of this on Saturday night. I have no idea why, but we'll get to what he put out on Truth Social regarding that. If you're just getting in your car, haven't heard yet, the MASN dispute is finally settled. Been going on for 20 years. 20 yeast since the Washington Nationals played their first game, which will be 20 years next month. First actual regular season game would be in April, but this was part of the deal to bring them here from Montreal, that the Orioles would control the television rights and they would split the revenue. Well, the splitting of the revenue was tied up in courts, for 20 years. And that's finally been resolved, and I think David Rubenstein, who bought the Orioles about a year ago, played a big part in that. The most important part of this is the Nationals are now on a one-year contract with MASN. At the end of the season, they are free to go. And I think once they do go, and I think they'll even be encouraged to go, I can't imagine that MASN is try and put together a deal to keep them. In fact, this is really just paving the way for that. That they collapse, and the Orioles and the Nationals both go to Ted Leonsis' platform, which is called Monumental, and they have a streaming service as well. And as opposed to years past, if you had a conflict on cable, like they will have in the early part of the season with the Caps and the Wizards, you would go to another channel. They would put it on, sometimes like Channel 50 would carry games. Does Channel 20 still exist? I think it does, kind of a thing like that. They don't have to do that anymore. They just say, we're only streaming one of the games. Where you can watch the Nats or Orioles on one of the MASN channels, but if you want to see the game, you have to stream it on and that'll create more revenue for Ted. Monumental is trying to bump up its streaming service because that's the way television is going. Cable TV, as we know it now, will probably cease to exist within the next 10 years, certainly. Okay, I'm at an age where like 5 or 6 years can pass, and we look back on an anniversary of something. Really? Has it been 5 years since that happened? It's the opposite with this one. Do you realize that it was only 1 year ago today, only 1 year, that Caitlin Clark passed Pete Maravich?
Now Caitlin at the line. For the record. She ties it with that one. This for college basketball history. She does it with a foul shot. Caitlin Clark becomes the all-time leading scorer in major college basketball history. Passing, pistol Pete Maravich is with Caitlin Clark.
Caitlin, a history-making shot from the free throw line there. Is that going through your mind at all?
Not really, but then when they announce it and everybody screams, that's when I knew. But pretty cool. A good half for us. I think we can do a little better job on defense and clean it up a little bit. But proud of our girls. We're fighting, and they're a really good team. They're going to give us everything they got.
So that was right before the half, and somewhat anticlimactic in that it was free throws. You would have hoped that she would have broken the record with her signature, from the logo 3. But that's the way it unfolded. Gus Johnson on the call for Fox last year. I believe the game was against Ohio State, and she passed Pete Maravich for most points ever scored. That was only a year ago. Since then, her team played for the national championship, and they lost the national championship. But because of her, I think in large part because of her, 18 million people watched that, whereas the World Series averaged 9.1 million, so almost double what the World Series got with a women's championship game. We also had, they lost to South Carolina, which was undefeated. Then she goes into the WNBA. We saw the controversy, how she transformed the league, how they have gone from a loss leader for the NBA now to a moneymaker. All of that happened within the last year with Caitlin Clark. At my age, it seems incredible that was the case. But it was only 1 year ago today that she set the record passing Pete Maravich. On the other hand, and this is even really before my time, I was alive, but not aware of it at the age of 3? Yeah, 63 years ago yesterday, Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in a game. It was a game in Hershey, Pennsylvania. They were playing the New York Knicks, and at that time, the NBA was fledgling. It had been around for about 15 years, but, they weren't drawing big crowds. They didn't have television contracts. And so to bump up interest in the Philadelphia area, although it was, a couple hours away, it wasn't the 76ers. It was the Warriors, the Philadelphia Warriors, played the New York Knicks at the Hershey Arena. The announced attendance was 4,124, perhaps bumped up a little bit by the preliminary game, which was off-season teams for the Philadelphia Eagles and the Baltimore Colts. And the top scorer for the Philadelphia Eagles in that game was Sonny Jurgensen. Sonny Jurgensen was a great basketball player in high school, could have played at North Carolina, and would have because he loved basketball, but he said he was only 6 feet tall and he thought he had a better chance in football, which he obviously did as he went on to the Hall of Fame. But he said that these teams, they would use those games to stay in shape, for one, and two, they got money. They were getting like $50 a guy to play in these games, and they would play like sometimes 40 or 50 games in an off season. $2,000 or $3,000 was meaningful, in those days. So that was part of it. They stayed in shape and they got a few extra bucks for playing. So anyway, Sonny's the leading scorer. The Eagles beat the Colts, and he's in the shower, and he finds out that the regular game has started between the Warriors and the Knicks, and he learns that Wilt has gotten 23 points at the end of the first quarter. So rather than drive back to Philadelphia, he says, I'm going to go watch the game. So Sonny was one of the 4,000-plus people who actually saw Wilt score 100 points. But all these years later, there still remains some doubters that it actually happened, even though there's a radio broadcast of that. And most importantly, there's a photo of Wilt Chamberlain. It's probably the most iconic photo, certainly of the NBA, and one of the most iconic photos in the history of sports. Wilt Chamberlain with a piece of paper in front of him with the number 100 written on it. I'll get to the backstory on that. But because Wilt was one given to exaggeration, and the timing on this could not have been worse, at the same time Magic Johnson announced that he had the HIV virus, Wilt had put out a biography in which he claimed to have slept with 20,000 women. Now, the math started, 20,000 women. That would mean from the time he was 15 years old until that point, when I guess he was about 55, 40 years, he had slept with an average of 1.2 women per day. And I know that was thrown off a little bit because I work with Steve Fredericks, who was the play-by-play announcer for the Philadelphia 76ers when Wilt played there. And he says, well, there was one 3-day period where we were snowed in Detroit, and all we did was play cards. So I don't know how that happened. I don't know if there were women. I don't know how they got to the hotel. But anyway, Wilt did put that out, that he had slept with 20,000 women, and that became a huge deal to the point where he was even on the Conan O'Brien show kind of har-har-harring about it.
Well, the fact-checking is difficult to do, as a matter of fact. But I interviewed one of the 20,000, a woman named Linda Huey, who became a great friend of Wilt's at the end of his life. She said, Wilt, why did you say 20,000? And Wilt's response was to wink and say, what's an extra zero between friends?
But, I thought maybe one of the reasons you invited me on the show was to give me an award from the Board of Education. Because whenever people see me now, they go, 20,000. And let's see, he must have started when he was like 15, and he's now maybe 55. So let's see, 20,365 into 20,000. And, and then...
So you're getting people thinking.
Not only that, I'm teaching them mathematics, which is really the whole story here, you understand?
I don't think that's going to be a word problem for kids. If Wilt Chamberlain is with 10 women on a train headed east...
That's right.
So the setup to that, Gary Pomerantz, who wrote the book Wilt 1962, in which he went in deep depth on the record-setting performance on March 2nd, 1962 at the Hershey Arena against the New York Knicks. And so he had done a lot of research on this. And one of the people that he talked to in researching the book was Darrell Imhoff. And Darrell Imhoff spent most of the game at center for the Knicks trying the best he could to stop Wilt Chamberlain. And when he interviewed him about 20 years ago, when he was putting the book together, and this would have been, 40 years after the fact, Darrell Imhoff actually, he didn't have doubts that Wilt scored 100, but he also said this and used this word to describe how Wilt scored his 100 points.
It was a farce of a game. It was not, I don't think it was a legitimate type of thing where a guy goes out in the course of the event. I mean, we had guys score 60 points. Elgin Baylor scored 60 points against us in the guard. I mean, that was a legitimate, great performance. Jerry West had 60 against us in the sports arena against...
Same year?
In that year. It was one of those things where guys had individual performances that were great, but it wasn't done the way that one was done, and that's what makes that a farce. I don't see it as one of the great games ever, and I think the 100-point game is totally out of context with what you would consider the great games that were played in the NBA by great players.
And to support that, and this is all part of the Pablo Torre Finds Out podcast, where he has Gary Pomerantz as a big part of it, and they put in the sound bites like that, and also you're going to hear and there was a radio broadcast. They only were able to salvage the fourth quarter. Bill Campbell on WCAU. There's no television for this, no still pictures from the game. The only picture is of Wilt holding up the sign for 100 points. But to the point that Imhoff makes about it being a farce, at the late stages of the game, with the Knicks down by like 20 points, and they lost the game by 22, 169-147, down big at the end, you don't foul. The team that's up, the Warriors, who were up 22, began to foul. If you're up 20 points, you're not trying to foul. You want to run out the clock. It went the other way. So to Imhoff's point about a farce, this is what Pablo and Gary Pomerantz discuss as to how it sort of became a farce late in the game.
With 7.5 minutes to play and everybody realizing now what the stakes were, the Knicks started not quite stalling, but sort of, couple extra passes. Then they start running a weave down court, taking the ball in 94 feet from the basket. The Warriors start committing fouls of the Knicks to get the ball back quicker, to get the ball to Wilt.
And cross-court to Butcher as they eat up as much time as they can. Butcher to the circle and fouled by Rogers. Warriors figured the only way to combat the New York storm was to come out and foul the backcourt men themselves.
If somebody walked into the arena and they see the Warriors fouling and the Knicks stalling, they're going to think the Knicks are ahead by 20, not the Warriors. That's where it breaks down.
Knowles is fouled by Joe Recklick, and they almost came to blows. New York, of course, you can understand the Knickerbockers' feelings. They're a little upset having it rubbed in a little bit like this with a guy on a scoring rampage.
Whether or not it became a farce is a serious question. You know, when the structure of the game breaks down and the team that's 20 points behind is stalling, something's weird, something's strange.
Yeah, you got a situation where you're beating somebody intentionally to make something happen, but that's what was going on. I mean, it wasn't in the flow of the game. Now, the first half, if you will, or first three quarters, it was certainly in the flow of the game. But when they started doing some things intentionally to foul and getting him the ball and left him in the game when the game was already over, I mean, it was obvious they were out to prove something, and so they did.
Yeah, that's a little bit of bitterness from Imhoff, as you can understand. But yes, the team that's ahead is not going to be fouling to slow down the game, and the team that's behind is not going to want to keep the ball and stall and not try and score just so they can keep Wilt from scoring. So in that regard, you could look at it as something of a farce. But let's realize this. It's 100 freaking points. No three-point line, and Wilt, who is a notoriously bad free throw shooter, was 28 of 32 in this game. He took 63 shots to get the 100 points. He was 36 of 63, but he still got to 100 points. And just to give you a little bit of perspective on this, the second place spot for most points in a game is Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant scored 81 points in a game with the three-point line, which is still miraculous. But if you take the difference between the 81 that Kobe scored and the 100 that Wilt scored in a game, that's a really good scoring game. If you get 19 points in a game, you had a good night. So that's the difference. Here is the chronicling of the 100 points and how they got there. This is the late stages of the game. Everybody in the arena, all 4,000 plus, know that Wilt is closing in on 100, though it's by word of mouth because Harvey Pollack's got it on the radio, but the scoreboard at the time was very primitive compared to what we have now. You would have the visiting team score and the home team score, and in the middle was a clock, and that was it. It wasn't even tenths of seconds. It was just minutes and seconds on the clock, and it was actual clock. It had a sweep hand. You didn't have the digital clock. It was just an actual clock and the team scores on each side. So you don't know, unless word of mouth is circulating through the arena, that he's closing in. Now, there are announcements from the PA announcer, the great Dave Zinkoff, Julius Erving. He was there then with the Philadelphia Warriors in Hershey. But this is Wilt and how the 100 points actually happened.
Well, Wilt would have 3 attempts at the 100-point basket. And, in fact, one of them came after he scored on that slam dunk to hit 98. He started to run down court and quickly turned around and stole the ball. And missed it from around the free throw line. Then he'd get 2 more attempts. And there's 50 seconds left, and now the Warriors have the ball. And Guy Rogers, who would have 20 assists on this night, a wonderful passer, he throws the ball down court, length of the court, to Wilt, who jumps, catches it because the next tallest Knick is 5 inches shorter.
Rogers throws long to Chamberlain. He's got it. He's trying to get up. He shoots. No good. The rebound, Luckenbill.
And Ted Luckenbill, a rookie, comes in, gets the rebound, gets it to Wilt again.
Back to Chamberlain. He shoots up. No good. In and out.
He misses. Luckenbill again.
The rebound, Luckenbill. Back to Recklick. Into Chamberlain. He made it. He made it. A different goal. He made it. The fans are all over the floor. They stopped the game. People are running out on the court. 100 points to Wilt Chamberlain. They stopped the game. People are crowding, pounding him, banging him. The Warrior players are all over him. Fans are coming out of the stands. 46 seconds left. The most amazing scoring performance of all time. 100 points for the Big Dipper.
And it took years. This recording of Bill Campbell on WCAU, fourth quarter, that wasn't found until 1990. So that was, 28 years after it happened? I mean, for a long time, we didn't have any audio evidence of Wilt scoring 100. What we had, the only thing that had endured from that night and what most people saw in the paper the following day or a couple of days later is Wilt Chamberlain sitting in his locker in Hershey, Pennsylvania, with a piece of paper with the number 100 on it. That's all there was. There was no video of this. There wasn't even any film. There was nothing. And that is the best evidence that we have, along with the radio broadcast. But, some say, that could have been doctored. Who knows? No, that happened. But the piece of paper is more than anything what endures of that 100-point night. And that was the work of Harvey Pollack, as is explained here by what was talked about on the podcast. It's Pablo Torre Finds Out, and Gary Pomerantz, who wrote the book Wilt 1962, lays it all out, what a big role Harvey Pollack played.
Harvey Pollack was a legend in Philadelphia basketball. He was an employee of the Philadelphia Warriors, then the Philadelphia 76ers, for 6 decades. And at the time this game is being played, he's known as the Octopus because he would send out a Christmas card every year with the octopus, each arm representing another thing he did. On this night, when Wilt scores 100, Harvey is the statistician. He is a publicist who's got to arrange any interviews. He's writing the game story for the Philadelphia Inquirer, who didn't care enough about it to send anybody. He's writing for AP, and he's writing for United Press. That's a lot of work. And in fact, when he finished the scorekeeping and added stuff up, he thought, oh my, what if Wilt ends out with 98 points? Well, one of the things you hear on the radio is, I think 3 times the final score is 169 to 150.
Butcher breaks down for an easy layup, and he's got it. 169 to 150.
Yeah, I was going to mention this. Yeah.
And the Knicks, now we look back at it and see the Knicks had 147. And no one could reconcile that for me. I think it was just sort of the slapdash nature of the whole night. And this was one more aspect of it. Oh, yeah, the Knicks, well, it doesn't matter what the Knicks got. All that matters is what Wilt got.
Right, there was that's it, right? The discrepancy between what the radio announcer was saying versus the official score. There's all this confusion. You hear it on the tape a couple of times. But what the octopus, he makes sure to establish that there is no ambiguity around how many points Wilt Chamberlain scored, because he does the thing that results in the one piece of evidence that I think every basketball fan has seen.
Pollack looks around and says, Hef, to Jim Heffernan, the sports writer of the Philadelphia Bulletin, let me borrow a sheet of paper. And he takes out what was a magic marker. I don't think they had Sharpies in 1962. I may be wrong on that. And he writes 100. And it's the backstory to this classic photo. And that might be the best picture in basketball history because of what it represents and who it represents. It's the Dipper on his night. Remember, this is a time when the NBA, even its statistics in the way stats were kept, they didn't count block shots. Somebody said, how many shots did Wilt block? I don't know. We just have the numbers that they kept. Did the Knicks score 147 or 150? I don't know. I don't know. But to me, it was about getting to the essence of this story. There are some questions. Whether or not it happened is not a question.
Absolutely. And just to put the exclamation on this, there is one living player from that night, March 2nd, 1962. That's Tom Meschery, who's 86 years old. He was a rookie for the Warriors that year, started at power forward alongside Wilt Chamberlain. And Pablo contacted him. And for all you doubters out there, if there are any doubters that Wilt actually scored 100, listen to what Tom Meschery says.
I don't think anybody could have guarded Wilt that night. I don't think Shaq at his very best discarded Wilt that night. Wilt was indomitable that night. Everything he threw up went in. It was a miracle game. And if Darryl thinks it was manufactured by the Lord God himself. I've never heard that Darryl said that. That makes me angry. That makes me really angry.
He accused you guys of pouring it on.
Of course we absolutely reported on. Reported on because we were going to help our teammates score 100 points. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I saw was a destruction. Just, unless my eyes were failing me, I saw destruction.
Just one more postscript on this. Cleveland Buckner, who played for the Knicks, as nobody was playing any defense in this game because, once the Warriors went up big, the goal was to get Wilt to 100 points. Cleveland Buckner, who played 68 games in the NBA over 2 years with the Knicks, that season scored 399 points. He only scored 411 for his entire career. Cleveland Buckner that night had 33 points. 33 points. He had almost 10% of his career points that night playing for the Knicks. But whether it was 150 or 147, what they scored, who knows? It goes down in the books as 147. It was 169 for the Philadelphia Warriors, but most importantly, it was 100 for Wilt Chamberlain. A couple of years later, the Warriors moved to San Francisco. The Syracuse Nationals moved to Philadelphia. They changed their name to the 76ers. And Wilt Chamberlain, a year or so after the team moves to the West Coast, is traded back to Philadelphia, where he wins a championship for the 76ers, then grows unhappy there, winds up with the Lakers. They have the 33-game win streak, 71-72. Wilt wins his second championship, walks away from the game in 1973 when he was 35 years old. For the next 15 years, people talked about Wilt Chamberlain making a comeback, and they were serious about it. That's the kind of shape that he stayed in, and that's the kind of incredible scorer that he was during his career. Now, at the end of his career, he was mostly a rebounder and a shot blocker, scoring, double digits, 13, 14 a game, but nothing like what happened that season, the 61-62 season, when he averaged over 50 points a game, and averaged over 48 minutes, meaning, including overtime, he never left the floor that season. Unfreaking believable, and believe it. It happened. It happened 63 years ago yesterday. Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in a game. Coming up, we'll get to the latest on the Pete Rose story and where this is going now with new reporting from Don Van Natta. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
Even from the grave, Pete Rose's name continues to be in the news as to what will happen next. It was August of 1989 that then Commissioner Bart Giamatti banned Pete Rose for life. There was a feeling at the time that he could apply for reinstatement within a year, but if it was going to happen, it wasn't going to happen with Bart Giamatti, who died of a heart attack a week later. Fay Vincent took his place. Fay Vincent just died recently, and Fay Vincent said, no, we're not going to put Pete in the Hall of Fame. And Bud Selig held the line on that. Rob Manfred has as well. In fact, he met with Pete 10 years ago and decided, no, we're not going to make any move to put him in the Hall of Fame. But we have this coming out over the weekend from Don Van Natta, who is a great investigative reporter for ESPN. And he writes, Commissioner Rob Manfred is considering a petition filed January 8th by Pete Rose's family to have Major League Baseball's all-time hit leader posthumously removed from baseball's ineligible list. Multiple sources with knowledge of the situation told ESPN on Saturday. Well, you think about this. Pete died in September, and it was a lifetime ban. The lifetime is over, so what does that mean? The family is being represented by Jeffrey Lenkoff, a Los Angeles lawyer who did represent Pete Rose until he passed away in September at the age of 83. He filed the reinstatement petition after he and Fawn Rose, who is the oldest daughter of Pete Rose, met with Rob Manfred and Major League spokesman Pat Courtney in the commissioner's office on December 17th. So this is new stuff. 10 years ago, there was a meeting with Pete Rose. The commissioner said no. December 17th, few months after Rose passes away, the daughter and the lawyer meet with Rob Manfred, and there seems to be some movement towards lifting the lifetime ban. Now, think about this. There's more to this than that. There's a misconception by the president, which is, not surprising because he doesn't spend a lot of time investigating things before he puts out things. But he put out something on Truth Social over the weekend, saying that he thinks that Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame and that he will personally pardon Rose. He said, this is what Trump put out on Saturday night. He said, over the next few weeks, I will be signing a complete pardon of Pete Rose, who shouldn't have been gambling on baseball, but only bet on his team winning. He never, and I don't think this is proper grammar for someone who's making English the official language of the U.S. Maybe he needs to use it a little bit better, but he said in his Truth Social statement, the president, he never betted against himself or any other team. I think the word would be bet. He had the most hits by far in baseball history. He had over 4,000 hits, but, so did Stan Musial. But anyway, won more games than anyone in history, although Trump did not say the pardon would cover the 5 months in jail that Rose served for pleading guilty to tax evasion in 1990. Usually a pardon would go to something like that. If he's issuing a pardon for baseball, it doesn't work that way. The president can't issue a pardon on behalf of Major League Baseball. That's up to baseball. And there are steps that are involved here. You have to recognize this. And I was there. When Bart Giamatti banned Pete Rose, he was asked in 1989, what about the Hall of Fame? And Giamatti said, I'll be interested in how you guys, meaning the sports writers, vote on that. He died a week later. 2 years later, 1991, the Hall of Fame passed a rule declaring that any player ruled ineligible by Major League Baseball could not appear on the ballot. This became known as the Pete Rose rule because it closely followed the indefinite banning of Rose. So the Hall of Fame tied itself to this. So they said to the writers, well, you can't even consider him for the Hall of Fame because we now have a new bylaw for the Hall of Fame that says anybody who's banned for life cannot be considered. Now, if it reaches the level that they now can consider Pete Rose, that if, in fact, Rob Manfred lifts posthumously the lifetime ban, then does it go to the Veterans Committee because the period of time after his retirement, which would have been 1986 or 87, that has exceeded the period of time where the sports writers could consider him. I think it's about 400 voters among people who vote for the Hall of Fame, that they would be the ones who would vote on him since he was never actually on the ballot, or would it go right to the Veterans Committee? And there could be a difference there. Younger people now looking at a sport where betting is legalized with, FanDuel and DraftKings and all that, baseball's in bed with it. Could they look at it another way? Or would the old-timers look at this in a way of, well, he broke the cardinal rule of baseball, he bet on the game, and he lied about it for 20 years. Not till 2004, in his last year of eligibility on the writer's ballot, did he say, oh, yeah, I bet on baseball. So there's that. Now, this goes back to October, right after Pete Rose died. Johnny Bench, his longtime teammate with the Reds, also a Hall of Famer, greatest catcher ever. He was on the Dan Patrick Show. And then remember, this is back in September. So this is back before this meeting reportedly took place between Pete Rose's family and lawyer and the commissioner. This is Johnny Bench speculating with Dan Patrick as to, now that Pete Rose has passed away, will he get into the Hall of Fame? Will Rob Manfred finally lift the lifetime ban? This is what Johnny Bench said back in October.
He's made that decision. He's had a one-on-one with Pete. He's had a one-on-one, hour and a half.
So no budging that he – what did you hear from that conversation he had with Pete?
Well, we know what his decision was. Nothing. No, you're not going to be on the ballot.
But he can't, and you know this better than anybody, Johnny, is this commissioner can't make that decision because you're going against Bud Selig and you're going against Bart Giamatti. And I don't think he wants this isn't a legacy that you want. I mean, this commissioner's done some good things for baseball. I just don't know. It seems hypocritical if you put him in posthumously.
Well, the thing that bothers me today is everything is gambling. You're probably being sponsored by something.
Yes.
I mean, we're now condoning it, and we're now seeing it. I'm watching the game yesterday, and I see 90% probability the Braves will win, 10% on the Met. Now they scored 3 runs. Now it's 60-40. I mean, now you got it on your phone where you can bet on swings. They say you can bet on foul balls. You can bet on pitchers, strikeouts. I mean, it's become part of it. And now we see a couple of young players who now have been banned from baseball or at least suspended. I think that's the thing we have to figure out.
But I can't. No, but you could alter
baseball's
the game.
looking at it differently. Baseball is actually looking at this differently now.
Well, they're doing this to make money off fans. You can't have the people involved in these games with the potential to alter the outcome. That's why I know they're in bed with gambling, but players can't be involved in this because they can manipulate the outcome, fix a game.
Well, so can the fans. Strangely enough, I mean, if you ever been to a golf tournament when a guy's in his backswing and somebody coughs or sneezes or his phone happens to chirp or anything else because he doesn't want him to hit the ball in the fairway or he doesn't want all of these, there's scenarios. These are possibilities. Yes, I understand the money's out there, and that's what it's all about, is having the owners and paying for the salaries that they've got out there. That's understandable. That's what we do. We're all in it for the dollar at this point, as they say, the owners would say. And that's what we're going to have to do. If we're going to give a $700 million contract, somehow we've got to pay for it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that, even in the, 700 million, 2 million, 50 million, that's a lot, but I think baseball is starting to take a different look at it now. Okay, we're condoning betting. And should we take another look at Pete? I've heard that.
Oh, okay. So that's important. His last sentence, that's back in October, and that's Johnny Bench, who said, I've heard that baseball is going to take a look at it. This would support the reporting that Don Bandata has here over the weekend, that Rob Manfred is considering a petition that was filed January 8th by Pete Rose's family to have him removed from the baseball ineligible list, which would pave the way for the Hall of Fame to perhaps consider him, because the rule that they put in place in 1991, 2 years after Rose's banishment, before he would have become eligible to be considered on the ballot because he hadn't been retired long enough, they said, nope, sorry, we're changing it. Anybody who's been banned from baseball can't be considered by the Hall of Fame. So once he's back reinstated posthumously, does that change for Hall of Fame voters, either for the Veterans Committee or for the regular voters who have never had Pete Rose's name available to them on the ballot? And although it would be coming 30 years after he would have been in the ballot had he not been caught gambling, what would have happened? And also, here's another thing. If Bart Giamatti bans him for life and Pete Rose admits right there that he bet on baseball, he serves a 5 or 6 year suspension and he's back. They didn't want to kick Pete Rose out of baseball, but by denying and selling memorabilia and trying to upstage the Hall of Fame ceremonies, he was a pain in the tuchus. They didn't want to deal with him anymore. And so that's why we've reached this point where he had to pass away for this possible movement to happen. I don't think the Trump thing is going to mean much in this. That's just, something else that creates attention for this. This is going to be between baseball and the Hall of Fame and the voters and the commissioner. All those things have to fall in place for him to be possibly considered for the Hall of Fame. Now, here's the domino thing. Here's the thing I wonder about. This is just speculation on my part. If, in fact, this happens, if Rose, and if he's on the ballot, I mean, he's got the numbers, but there is a character issue in baseball. In football, there's nobody going to take O.J. Simpson out of the Hall of Fame because character is not considered. It's only what you did on the field. Baseball character is important here. And if he broke the cardinal rule of baseball and lied about it for over 20 years, 30 years, should he be considered? That's a question. And that's going to be something that'll be ultimately decided at some point by either, baseball officials or the Hall of Fame committee. Those are things that are all going to have to fall into place. You also have this, though. If Pete Rose does wind up in the Hall of Fame, what happens to the steroid guys? And there's a story from Bob Nightingale in USA Today out today where he talks to Sammy Sosa. And Sammy Sosa is in spring training with the Cubs. Hadn't been there in 21 years. Remember, he finished his career, I believe, with the Orioles after finishing up with the Cubs in the early part of the century, I believe. And he was asked by Nightingale about the whole, steroid thing, which is keeping Sosa out of the Hall of Fame as well. And he says, I don't want to go that route, not now. But then he started talking again. He said, that's a very delicate route. You know what I mean? But come on, nobody was blind, meaning, everybody knew who was using steroid at the time. It's what's kept Alex Rodriguez and Manny Ramirez and others, Bonds and Clemens and so forth. There were suspicions of performance-enhancing drugs for Mike Piazza and Jeff Bagwell. They both got in. I guess the suspicions were less because in the cases of Sosa and Bonds and Clemens, they never failed a drug test. But the Hall of Fame's Contemporary Baseball Era Committee is meeting in December, and they will vote whether Bonds, Clemens, and Sosa will be elected if their wants will continue. Sosa is hopeful, according to Nightingale. He says, I believe in time. Nobody's perfect. Time will heal all wounds. I really believe that one day the door will open for us. There are voters like Tim Kirkchin, a baseball historian, loves baseball, thinks they should get in. My friend Tom Lavero, who's a voter as well, says they should never get in. We'll see where this goes. But Mark McGwire also talked to USA Today, and he says something that's not quite correct. He was talking about the steroid issue, and he said there was nothing illegal about it. No, it was illegal. They just weren't testing. Steroids were declared illegal in 1991, okay? So this was long before the great home run chase of 1998 where he hit 70 home runs. He said there was no testing. This is McGwire. There was no testing at the time. It was a widespread thing in the game. It wasn't like you're feeling guilty. The mentality was to keep yourself healthy on the field. But it was illegal. That's important. No testing, but it was illegal. He says, looking back now, yeah, I feel horrible about that. I wish there was testing. I wish there were some regulations. If there were rules and regulations, that never would have even crossed my mind to do something like that. But there was nothing like that back in the day. Believe me, if there was, it never would have happened. And then Sosa was asked about those comments, and he said, I agree with what he said. There was no testing. There were no rules. We didn't break any laws. No, you did. You broke rules that were in place in 1991 that you couldn't use steroids. It's just they couldn't get the union to agree to test. They were testing in the minor leagues, but the baseball union wouldn't go for it. One former GM, this is how nuts things got, a former GM said to Nightingale, he wouldn't name the player, but he said, I named a player that he knew was using it. Once we got him, he stopped using, and he stunk, and it cost me my job. They didn't begin testing for performance-enhancing drugs until 2004. They began banning amphetamines in 2006 and started testing for HGH with blood samples in 2013. So here's my question, and I don't know when and if it'll get answered, but if Pete Rose gets in the Hall of Fame, does that clear the way for steroid users? Because there's a lot of things going on in the world right now which used to be not okay, which seem to be okay. And that's the direction we're heading, and I don't think it's in a good way, personally. All right, that's a wrap for me. Bram is coming up next. I'll see you back here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.